Thank you, Pastor, for allowing me the opportunity to be able to preach tonight, share from God's Word. I had considered doing a follow-up sermon to Pastor Matt's Sunday sermon on the friendship of Jonathan and David, and I was going to do sort of like a slightly updated version, slightly modern version, with David Lopez and Dr. Jonathan Riefin. Oh wait, that's not the right slide. Oh, there it is. There you go. Because we have to make sure that David had slain the giant and was carrying the head of the giant. But I decided against doing the follow-up to that sermon. And we're going to talk about David's son, Solomon, and the wisdom that he has to share in the book of Ecclesiastes. So this is a picture of PS3 as seen from above. From Google Earth. Here are the parameters of PS3. You can sort of see it a little bit better. This gold box is the gym where we meet on Sunday mornings for the main service. And then this light green box is the cafeteria where we do our coffee hour every Sunday. So a couple weeks ago, I had left PS3, and I just want to show you the route that I took. I made a left down Hudson, and then I made that immediate left down Grove. And I got to that first intersection there on Bedford and Grove, and I saw a small crowd there. And you often see, Kristen just said always, you always see a crowd at the intersection of Bedford and Grove, and they're standing there, and they're looking up, and they're taking pictures. And what exactly are they doing there, Kristen?
A picture from a TV show building.
Yes, they're taking pictures in front of the Friends apartment. So there was a show from the 1990s called Friends, and it was super popular, super successful, and it was about 6 New Yorkers, and even though it was filmed on a soundstage in Los Angeles in front of a studio audience, it was supposedly set in New York. So when they would, in between scenes, sometimes they would flash to the building in New York where they lived, and this was the building on Bedford and Grove. So it's right there on the corner, catty corner to PS3. And so fans of the show come here from all around the world, and one of the things they want to see is the Friends apartment, and they want to take pictures in front of the Friends apartment. And why is that? Well, it's because Friends was one of the biggest sitcoms, if not the biggest sitcom, of all time. And there's a reason why I'm telling you this. Don't worry, Charlie's looking at me. He's giving me some strange looks here. But it was a huge show in the 1990s, and it was evidenced by, even if you didn't ever watch the show, maybe you heard just from pop culture, that each one of the 6 main cast members, by the end of the series, they were making $1 million per episode. And so this was more than 20 years ago. That was pretty unheard of, the idea that every week they would film an episode and pocket $1 million. But I think that even more surprising than that is the fact that even more than 20 years later, each one of those cast members makes more than $20 million per year from the reruns of the show. And they've done surveys, who was your favorite friend? And the most popular friend at the top of the survey was Chandler Bing. He was sort of the jokester of the group, and he was played by an actor, Matthew Perry. Okay, so I was walking down, I walked past the group of Friends fans, and I just started thinking about the 1990s, because I was a teenager in the 90s. High school, middle school, I moved to New York in 1997. And what else was going sort of in pop culture? What else was going on in the 1990s? Well, the biggest album, the biggest record of the 1990s was the Bodyguard soundtrack by the singer named Whitney Houston. So she had starred in this movie where she was a singer in the movie. Somebody was trying to kill her. She hired a bodyguard, and of course, they fell in love. And the movie itself was a hit, but even more of a hit than the movie was the album. Almost all the songs from the album went to #1, and they stayed there for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it was actually the biggest selling female album of all time. And she was already successful before that. What was the biggest band in the 1990s? Well, they were called Nirvana. And they were the biggest band as far as record sales, but also critics. They pointed to this band and they said, they really changed. One of the things was they changed the way that musicians looked. So before that, in the 1980s, musicians were a little more put together, let's say glamorous. They wore costumes. And these guys just looked like they rolled out of bed. And so Kurt Cobain, who was the lead singer, he was voted one of the coolest people, if not the coolest person of the 1990s. So what did these people have in common? Matthew Perry, Whitney Houston, Kurt Cobain. They all had riches, They could buy whatever they wanted. They all bought massive houses and cars. They all had success, so each one of them reached the very tip top of their industry, number one, whether it was TV shows, movies, music. And they each had incredible amounts of fame. So they had hundreds of thousands of adoring fans, and they actually influenced culture. But the thing that they really had in common, they had, all these ingredients that society would tell us are the ingredients for the good life. But the truth is, for them, it was not enough. So they had riches, they had success, they had fame, but it was not enough. Because each one of them was addicted to drugs and alcohol in the height of their success. So for instance, Matthew Perry, he died about 1.5 years ago of a drug overdose. He was 54 years old. Whitney Houston was only 2 years older than I am now, and she drowned in her bathtub. She had, she was addicted to crack cocaine. She drowned in her bathtub the night before the Grammys. And then Kurt Cobain was 21 years younger even than that. He was only 27, and he was at the peak of his career when he committed suicide under the influence of drugs and alcohol. So on the one hand, we live in a society not so different than the societies of old that tell us that the ingredients for a good life are riches, success, and fame. So we have that on the one hand, but then on the other hand, we have these very extreme examples of the exact opposite. These people who have reached that pinnacle of the good life, and yet it wasn't enough. So my question tonight is, if only humanity could learn. Why can't humanity learn? Because this is not a new lesson. This is a lesson that has been in the Bible for 3,000 years, and it's very specifically laid out in the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, I love the book of Ecclesiastes. Some people think that it's a little bit depressing. I don't, because I feel like you have to read it from a certain angle for it not to be depressing, but I have never found it depressing. But we're going to look at chapter 2 tonight from Ecclesiastes, my favorite chapter. And let's start by reading Ecclesiastes chapter 2. We'll read verses 2 through 11, and then we'll pray. Okay, so Ecclesiastes 2, 1 through 11 says, I said in mine heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, and behold, this also is vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? I sought in mine heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainted mine heart with wisdom, and to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was that good for the sons of men, which they should do under the heaven all the days of their life. I made me great works. I builded me houses. I planted me vineyards. I made me gardens and orchards, and I planted trees in them of all kinds of fruit. I made me pools of water, to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I gat me servants and maidens, and had servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold, and the particular treasure of kings and of provinces. I gat me men singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. So I was great, and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy. For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, God, we just thank you tonight for this book of Ecclesiastes, Lord, and I just pray, Lord, that as we look into the wisdom that you gave King Solomon to write these words, Lord, I pray that we can each glean what you would have us to glean out of these words, Lord. So just strengthen me, give me your word, and I pray this in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so Ecclesiastes starts, the very first verse of it much in the same way that the Apostle Paul, when he wrote a letter, he would say, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. He would identify himself as the author of the letter. So in Ecclesiastes 1:1, it says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. And we know that that man is Solomon. So he doesn't use his name, but he describes himself very specifically. And then in verse 12, he says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. So it's interesting that he calls himself the preacher. He's saying, I am going to impart wisdom on you like a preacher imparts onto the assembly. And Ecclesiastes comes from the word ecclesia, which means church. So it's almost as if King Solomon is the preacher and we are his church as we read the book of Ecclesiastes. So what is this preacher writing about? Well, verse 2, he says right away, and most scholars would say that this verse is the theme of Ecclesiastes. So he says, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So it's a short verse, it's only 12 words, and 5 of those words are vanity. So we better quickly figure out what he means by the word vanity. So the Hebrew word, which is translated vanity, is used 38 times in the book, and it literally means vapor or breath. So when he says all is vanity, it's like all is a breath. It's here today and gone tomorrow. The deeper meaning, though, is it's unsatisfying, it's empty, it's meaningless. So the theme of the verse, I can see why people think it's a depressing book, that the theme of the book is that all is unsatisfying, empty, and meaningless. But what Solomon does here is he's asking this big question: does life have meaning? Solomon is asking, does life have meaning? And he is determined to find out the answer. And in the first chapter, before we get to the second chapter, he kind of gives his bona fides, and he's saying, I am qualified. I'm actually qualified to find out this answer, and I'm determined to do it. So he says in verse 16, he said, I have gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had experience of wisdom and knowledge. So he says, I'm qualified to figure out this answer more than anybody, and I'm going to find it out. So does life have meaning? And what Solomon is going to do here is he's going to come at this question from all different angles throughout the 12 chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes. But I would say that chapter 2, in my opinion, is the key chapter of the book. I think it doesn't cover everything in all the other 12 chapters, but if you can get a handle on chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes, I believe that you get the gist of what the book is about. It's almost like an Ecclesiastes in miniature. So, starting out here, Ecclesiastes 2:1, he says, I said in mine heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth, therefore enjoy pleasure. So Solomon is giving us this access into his internal dialogue. He's originally talking to himself here. He said, I said in mine heart. So he said to himself, I'm going to figure this out. And the first thing he said that he's going to do is he's going to look for meaning by indulging in pleasure. And that word mirth, we see it a couple times in the first couple verses. The word mirth is just another word for pleasure. So he's going to indulge in pleasure. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? I sought in mine heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom. So the first thing that Solomon is going to look at, and if you're following along in your notes, you can write this down. He's looking for meaning, and he says, is it found in wine and pleasure? And we see this in verses 1 through 3. Is meaning found in wine and pleasure? So what I did was I figured, well, what else does Solomon have to say about wine? Because he has a few things to say, and I immediately went to Proverbs chapter 20, verse 1. And Solomon says here, wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. So we have this picture of a drunkard, and so Solomon is saying, if you let wine control you, this is what you're going to end up like. And then in Proverbs 23, 31 through 32, it says, look not thou upon wine when it is red. At the last, it biteth like a serpent, and it stingeth like an adder. So he's saying, just like a snake bite can be deadly, so is wine. So it's not exactly a 5-star review of wine here, but he says that he is going to give himself unto wine, but I think the key phrase right after that is, yet acquainting mine heart with wisdom. So wine was probably a typical beverage in Solomon's day. I think a lot of people would say it was much more watered down than the wine that we have today. But the key here is that Solomon says, I'm not going to let wine control me. I might have a little bit of wine, but I'm not going to let it get to the place where I'm a drunkard, where it controls me. I'm going to control and see if meaning is in this place. And so when we talked about these celebrities earlier, they were under the influence of hard alcohol and hard drugs. So that is totally different than what I believe Solomon is saying here. So is meaning found in wine and pleasure? Well, let's see. He says in verse 1, he says, and behold, this also is vanity. So, nope. Meaning is not found in wine and pleasure. And the other thing I didn't mention was wine. I think he means it literally, but I also think it's a symbolism of sort of like the luxuries of life. So he's going to indulge in the luxuries of life. And he says that is also vanity. It's meaningless. It's empty. The next place he goes, verse 4, I made me great works. I builded me houses. I planted me vineyards. I made me garden, orchard. I planted trees in them of all kinds of fruit. I made me pools of water to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. So the next thing that Solomon is going to look to is he's going to say, is meaning found in works? So he uses that term, great works. And what he then describes is building projects. So he calls it great works, but it's building projects, really. And we know that Solomon was a builder, right? So what did Solomon build? He built the temple in Jerusalem. That's right. So his father David had acquired much, if not all, of what he would need to build the temple. But it was Solomon himself who spent 7 years overseeing the project of building the temple. And not only that, he built himself a palace. 1 Kings 7:1 says, but Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all his house. So he spent 7 years on the temple. He spent 13 years on his house. Some people have something to say about that, but the idea being that, at least for 20 years, he had these big building projects going. So we don't know exactly what Solomon's palace would have looked like, but he says he built great works, he built houses, he planted vineyards, there were gardens, there were orchards with fruit trees, and then pools of water. And so even though we don't know exactly what it looked like, we can imagine that it was a grand place to live. And it was beautiful, and it was well curated, and it was luxury. The next place he goes, I got me servants and maidens, and had servants born in my house. I got me men singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. So the next place he looks, he says, is meaning found in workers. So there's the works, the great works, the building projects. But if you do a building project, you need workers. And so he had all kinds of servants, and he even said that the servants multiplied in his house. So when they had children, those two became his servants. And the servants, they would be the ones who were doing the building and the farming and the gardening and the cooking and the cleaning and the designing of apparel and the sewing and the singing and the playing of instruments and the entertaining. So Solomon was a very hands-on type of guy, but if he had wanted to, he could have just been waited on hand and foot. And he could have said, is this the meaning of life? Just that luxury of being waited on hand and foot. So the next place he goes, I had great possessions of great and small cattle above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold, treasure of kings. So I was great and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. And whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. Found in wealth. And we know that Solomon was the wealthiest man that had lived in Israel up until that time, and probably after. Read 1 Kings 10, the whole chapter, but if you do, you can just see it's gold, weapons out of gold, and shields out of gold, and dishes out of gold, and goblets out of gold, and he has talents of silver and gold. And in fact, the Queen of Sheba, she reacts to Solomon this way when she sees, it says, And when the queen of Sheba had seen all Solomon's wisdom, and the house that he had built, and the meat of his table, and the city, and his cupbearers, and his ascent by which he went up unto the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. So Sheba had seen his works and his workers and his wealth. It says it really just took her breath away. So, do you think and wealth? And then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. So no, meaning was not found there. Okay, so far we've looked at whether or not he found meaning in wine and pleasure, works, workers, and wealth, and the answer is no. And we also see that with those examples I gave at the beginning of the sermon with the celebrities that were big stars in the 90s. But, I think it's human to ask ourselves, well, what about if somebody had even more than that? What if they actually reached a pinnacle higher than everybody that we talked about who had more? Well, there was one celebrity who reached even more than all three of the ones that I was talking about. Michael Jackson, known as the King of Pop. So Michael Jackson had #1 albums, #1 songs. He had worldwide concert tours where fans flocked. They would scream and cry when he came out. He had groundbreaking and one of the things I found, he is still the highest earning celebrity, even though he's been dead for 15 years. So Taylor Swift was the #1 living celebrity last year, and pastors talked about $250 million this year. Michael Jackson's estate made $600 million last year, more than any living celebrity. So he was bigger than them all. And again, even I didn't watch the Grammys on Sunday, but I heard that they performed 2 of his songs on the Grammys, even still today, 15 years later. So I want to talk just for a minute about Michael Jackson's search for happiness. So he became famous when he was a very young child. He was part of the Jackson 5. He was the youngest member. It was him and his 4 brothers. And it came out later that his father was kind of abusive and really pushed them to work. It's not necessarily that they wanted to be performing as little children. And so Michael Jackson, when he became an adult, he wanted to sort of recreate and relive his childhood. So he built for himself a giant ranch in California called Neverland Ranch. And he named it Neverland. If you ever watch Peter Pan lived in Neverland, and he was like a little boy that never wanted to grow up. So Michael Jackson was telling us that he wanted to be young again, even in the name of his property. So just like Solomon, he had houses, multiple houses. He had pools. He had gardens. He had trees. He had a private movie theater on his property, complete with a concession stand with snacks and popcorn. But the main thing that he did was he actually built sort of like a mini Disneyland in front of his house. And so it was a mini amusement park with rides and games and restaurants and trains, and he would enjoy it for himself, but he would also invite various families to come and enjoy Neverland Ranch. And then another thing he had was he had llamas, exotic birds, and he even had a famous bubble meaning in life and the pleasure and the works and the wealth that he was able to gain? No. Because he ended up similar to the other 3 that I mentioned. He died at the age of 50. 6 different drugs were found in his system when he died. And so all of it is vanity and vexation of spirit. And, maybe now you are but we have to sort of go through it to get to the happy ending. So the next place Solomon looks, Ecclesiastes 2:12 through 14. And I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. Then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly as far as light excelleth darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness. So what do you think number 3 is? It starts with a W. Is meaning found in wisdom. Yes. And again, Solomon was qualified to ask this question because he even told us in chapter 1 that he had more wisdom than all they that have been before him in Jerusalem. So I love the passage of 1 Kings chapter 3 where Solomon has this dream. He has this vision of the Lord. He had gone up to Gibeah and he had sacrificed 10,000 animals to the Lord. And so the Lord said to him, ask me what you want, Solomon, and I'm going to give you whatever you want. And so Solomon says, okay, Lord, you're going to give me whatever I want. Well, I am vulnerable. I'm just a little child. You know, I'm taking over from my father, who was King David, and he ruled the people of Israel so well. And I'm just not equipped to do that. So what I want from you, Lord, is wisdom. Give me wisdom. And God said, you have wealth and life, their military enemies, so give you more wisdom. Solomon got that from the Lord, and we know that from the book of 1 Kings. And so again, Solomon, I think, is uniquely qualified to ask the question, is life's meaning found in wisdom? And Solomon, he speaks very highly of wisdom. So the opposite of how he spoke about wine. In Proverbs chapter 3, verses 13 to 15, it says, happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding. It is better than silver, and the gain thereof of fine gold. She, wisdom, is more precious than rubies, and all the things that canst desire are not to be compared unto her. So he's saying, okay, we already talked about wealth, but wisdom is even better than any kind of wealth. He goes on to describe wisdom. He says it brings pleasantness, peace, long life, grace, safety, fearlessness, sweet sleep, a crown of glory. Wisdom brings honor. And Solomon says that wisdom is like a tree of life, and he even says it's a tool of God's creation. Now that could be a whole study on its own, but the idea that when God created the earth, he created it using wisdom. So maybe we shouldn't look at celebrities. Maybe who we should look at to find the meaning of life is scientists and inventors and people who discover great things and find out if they have the meaning of life. So what do you guys think? Is meaning found in wisdom? Life's meaning found in wisdom? Oh, I'm not getting any shaking of heads here. This sounds like a trick question. Well, let's see what Solomon said. He said, then I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, so it happeneth even to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For there is no remembrance of the wise more than of the fool forever. Therefore, I hated life, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit. So no, life's meaning is not found in the wisdom that Solomon is talking about here. And, even secular scientists, non-Christian, Nikola Tesla, he said, life is and will ever remain an equation incapable of solution. He said there's lots of things in the universe that life is. The fourth and final thing in this chapter that Solomon looks to is meaning found in work. And we already said works earlier, but this is the type of work, labor. So he's talking about labor here. Is meaning found in work. And instead of exploring it and then giving us the answer, Solomon just really cuts to the chase here. So in verse 18 he says, yea, I hated all my labor, which I had taken under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me. And who knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool? Yet shall he have rule over all my labor wherein I have labored, and wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun. This is also vanity. So he says right away, no, work, as in labor, is not the meaning of life. And it's interesting because he says, not only is it not the meaning of life, he says, I hated it. I hated it. When I looked at it, I hated it. And he said, the reason why he hated it, he gives one reason. I'm going to break it down into two here. He says, because I should leave it. So Solomon recognized that he was a mortal human and his life was only going to be so long. And whatever he gathered in terms of his work, whatever fruit of his labor he was able to gather, he was going to leave it behind. He couldn't take it with him. And this reminds me of Jesus' famous parable of the rich fool found in Luke chapter 12. And so I'm going to turn there. You can turn there with me also. I'm just going to read a couple verses here. Luke chapter 12, 15 through 21. And he, Jesus, said unto them, take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. And he spake a parable unto them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits? And he said, this will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then who shall those things be which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So it's this very famous parable. We all know it. But the idea is, just when you think you have enough, just when you think that the fruit of your labor is enough, and you're gonna live out your golden years and relax and retire and just enjoy the fruit of your labor, God says, no, that's the night that your soul could be taken from you. So for your focus in your life to be on gathering up fruit of your labor, it's foolish. Okay, so he says, because I should leave it. And then the second part of that phrase is, unto the man that shall be after me. So not only is he going to leave it, but he's going to have to leave it to somebody. And that somebody could be wise like he is, or he could be a fool. And Solomon is not going to be able to control that. And again, he had this unique experience where his father, David specifically said, you are already gone through that process. And for him, he thought he was wise, so that was a good thing. But when he was going to die, he knew that he may leave it to somebody wise. He may leave it to somebody foolish. He may leave it to somebody wise who gets it taken from them by somebody foolish. So the idea is just that you can't control the fruit of your labor after you die. And we sort of understand this. We do have in this world leaders who then pass on the kingdom to their children. So we had Queen Elizabeth died, I think it was just last year. And so her son, Prince Charles, became King Charles. And, by most accounts, people think in general that she was a really good queen. She was queen for over 60 years. And who knows if her son is going to be a good ruler of England. In the middle there, I threw the North Korean dictators Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un. And we sort of understand this from an American perspective a little bit. It's definitely different. But we've had multiple presidents, where their son then becomes president. And even if that president is alive, they can't control what the son does in the country that they sort of left behind. Just one more quick example with Michael Jackson. So Michael Jackson made $1.2 billion during his 40-year career, $1.2 billion. But guess how much money he made since he died? 3.3. So almost 3 times as much. He made almost 3 times as much in the last 15 years as he did while he was alive. Now, can he control what happens to that 3.3 billion from the grave? No, and he tried. He did a trust. That's what you're supposed to do. He did a trust. He left money to his 3 kids and his mother. But 15 years later, I read today that Michael Jackson's estate is not yet settled. The estate has been in probate in the court system since Jackson's death in 2009 due to legal challenges. So all different kinds of people are trying to sue and get in on it and get some money. And also tax disputes with the IRS, because Uncle Sam is also trying to get his money. So Michael Jackson cannot control his money from the grave. So what is the conclusion to what we're saying here? Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 2:20 and 23, he says, "Therefore, I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. For all his days are sorrows, and his travail grief. If not in the night, this is also vanity." So, meaning, according to Solomon, is not found in wine and pleasure. It's not found in works, workers, or wealth. It's not found in work or labor. And he didn't talk about this one in this chapter, but he in women. And again, Solomon was uniquely qualified as he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And he did talk about women later in chapter 7. So meaning is not found in all these places. So I would just say at this point, if I was reading the chapter for the very first time, I would say, Solomon, brother, don't leave us hopeless here. What is the final conclusion? And thanks the 24, it says there's should make enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw that it was from the hand of God. Verse 26, for God hath given to a man that is good in his sight, wisdom and knowledge and joy. So the final answer that Solomon gives us, and it's quick, but he repeats it, later in the book. He repeats it a couple times. The final answer is a relationship with God brings meaning to all aspects of life. So it's not just that God is the meaning of life. Yes, that's true. But it's even better in that God brings meaning to all of the aspects of our life. So he lists a couple of them here just quickly. He says, eat and drink. So we think about that pleasure that he was talking about. We think of the good in his labor. We think about the work that he's doing. If God is at the center of your life, you can go back through that list and find meaning in all those different things that we talked about. So it's not just vexation and vanity. So why did Solomon have to go through all this exercise if he already knew God? He had that very specific conversation with God in 1 Kings, and he built the temple. He had a unique relationship with God in heaven. So why do you think he had to go through this exercise if he already knew God? And I would just say that each one of us, each person needs to find out the answer to this question. Does life have meaning? That is the question that, even secular people, the biggest question, I think, what is the meaning of life? Does life have meaning? And I would say that most people cannot learn the answer just by you telling them. I could tell you what the answer is based on what I just said, but most people don't learn it that way. Most people have to learn it through some level of experience. And I would just encourage you tonight that, you don't have to learn it the hard way, especially you young people. You don't have to learn this lesson the hard way. You can actually learn it from God through Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes. And I think the other reason that Solomon went through this exercise is because Solomon is an example for us. So Paul says in the New Testament, he says, there are things that happen in the Old Testament, and they literally happen, but it's also an example for us. So we have this example of Solomon going through all these things. And, we're never going to be as rich as Solomon. We're never going to be as wise as Solomon. We're never going to have the pleasures, maybe, the life, creature comforts that Solomon had. So, but we can look to him and say, wow, he had literally the highest level of all these things, and that didn't bring meaning and joy and happiness without God. So, 4 things that I want to just quickly leave you with tonight. Number 1, recognize that all you have is from the hand of God. And that's what Solomon said. Recognize that all you have is from the hand of God. So, whether you have a minute commute like Had does to get here in the night, or whether you have a 2-hour commute, recognize that that is from the hand of God, and maybe you even chose that. Whether you have a big palace like Solomon had, or whether you have a small apartment in New York City, recognize that that is what God gave you, and that is what God meant for you to have at this point in your life. Second point, be thankful. Okay, the Bible says this all over the whole Bible. Be thankful. So we have to be thankful, and I'm a big proponent of this. I may not be the best at it. I'm not an expert. But I think that being grateful and having gratitude really changes your whole perspective. And I would say that I've read even secular scientific studies that say this as well, that if you are thankful, that it can actually change your brain. It can actually change the pathways inside your brain if you're thankful. And I think certainly it does change our perspective. Thankful. Third, keep the Lord at the center of it all. So we we're Christians. We're here at prayer meeting, Heritage Baptist Church. In general, I think all of us keep God at the center of our lives. But there are times when you're blindsided. You realize that maybe you had more faith or more hope in something in your life than you thought you did. Like if anyone here has ever lost a job, you might have realized that you actually put more weight on that job as far as your identity than you meant to. I talked to somebody last week, and she told me that she's going through cancer treatments, and we're going to be praying for her later, but she told me that her hair is her identity. She would say she was a Christian. If that's what you think will you and bring you happiness, it's okay to be upset if you lose your hair, if you have cancer. That is definitely okay. I would be upset too. But if your hair is your identity, then you're putting your identity in something that is fleeting. And so we have to keep the Lord at the center of it all. So again, we can all look at our lives and think that the grass is greener on the other side. We can all wish we had more money or fame or things or servants. But we have to be enjoying the life that God has given us, because that's the one that he wants us to have. And that may change, of course, over the years. And maybe when we're older, we will have more money and we'll have less financial struggles or whatever it is. But if you look to the future instead of enjoying the present, that's going to make a huge difference in your life. So I just want to read one last verse. It's from Ecclesiastes chapter 5, but I feel like it's where Solomon just kind of reiterates the points that he just made. He said, "Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God." Okay, Pastor.